Caution. The AJ and Quill show contains D&D content and is intended for a D&D audience. And, besides that, they're really weird. Hi everyone, welcome to Meta Adjacent, your stop for player tactics in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. I'm Professor AJ, and with me as always is my fearless companion, Quill the Dragon. Say hi, Quill.
Greetings, puny humans. Prepare to absorb the knowledge Quill will dispense with his mighty jaws.
Well, that bell means that it's time for school to start. Pull out your notebooks and let's get going.
So, what are we covering today?
With the recent release of the Tal'Dorei Reborn campaign setting and the upcoming Call of the Netherdeep, all from Map vs. World of Exandria, we've decided to do a series covering the subclasses that you could use inside the Exandria setting from the Tal'Dorei Reborn campaign setting book. Now, whether they're calling on the forces of nature, or they're emulating the various different animals that appear in it, Druids embody nature's resilience, cunning, and fury.
Druids claim no mastery over nature. Instead, they see themselves as extensions of nature's indomitable will.
But what happens when nature itself gets corrupted? Today we're going to be discussing the new Druid Circle of the Blighted from the Tal'Dorei Reborn campaign setting. Inspired by the corrupted nature of the Savalierwood from Campaign 2,
The Mighty Nine,
the Circle of the Blighted Druid shows exactly what happens when something dark takes over a Druid's chosen location. Now, Druids are super interesting, they're really fun, but we've never actually covered them yet on this channel.
For starters, let's go over their ability profile. Druids need wisdom.
Right, wisdom is their spellcasting ability. It's their most important offensive stat.
And for their primary defensive stat, Druids should choose Constitution.
Now, this will give Druids the combat profile of a support caster, similar to a healer or a cleric.
Now we say they should choose Constitution as their primary defensive ability, as opposed to Dexterity.
Right, if they had chosen Dexterity as their primary defensive ability as a caster, that would make them more like a caster DPS or a spell slinger.
But there are reasons we say choose Constitution.
Right. Druids have a whole bunch of concentration requiring short-ranged buff, debuff, or healing spells in their spellcasting list.
Things like Cure Wounds or Greater Restoration.
Right, now, since these are all short range, a Druid needs to be closer to the front line of combat where all the action is to be able to administer these spells.
So we say a Druid is a mid-range character.
Right, being close to the front line of combat means they're probably going to get attacked more. So they need the good constitution for the extra hit points so they can stay up in combat, and to make it easier to survive those concentration checks after they get hit.
This also means that Druids should armor up as much as possible.
Which brings us to our second point. Druids are also proficient with medium armor and shields.
This means that using Dexterity as their primary defensive stat won't increase their armor class defense above 14.
Right, so having a Dexterity higher than 14 really won't give them any extra benefit, aside from maybe skill checks and initiative.
And the third reason that we say they should choose Constitution is Wild Shape.
Right, Wild Shape is a really unique ability that only Druids get. So outside of Wild Shape, Druids basically fight like a support caster, but once they get into Wild Shape, everything changes.
Your role in combat is largely determined by your stats.
Right, and a little bit by your class and your subclass, but even those things emphasize certain stats to use. But the interesting thing about Druids and their Wild Shape ability is it lets them change their stats.
This means it lets them change their role in combat.
Now, Wild Shape is kind of like a rage mechanic.
I would like to rage. This is kind of like what barbarians do with their rage, or blade singers do with their blade song.
And there's a few other examples, but basically Wild Shape does a few things. Firstly, Wild Shape gives Druids extra hit points.
Secondly, Wild Shape gives Druids much better melee attacks to use with their strength.
Right, which would be the strength of whatever animal they turned into.
And in many cases, their animal form has things like multi-attack, or riders that go with their attacks, being able to push creatures prone.
Right, these bonuses let Druids be able to go up to the front line of combat and act like tanks or heavy melee damage dealers.
Druids are very adaptable.
Right, so that means that Druids have a choice to make in combat, based on what their party needs more in any given moment. They can stay in their humanoid form and act as a healer and a controller,
Or they can change into their wild shape and become a durable melee damage dealer. Now, each Druid subclass does impose a slight bias on that decision.
Moon Druids, for example, transform a lot faster and into much more powerful creatures. This leans them more towards wild shape. Whereas Land Druids are way better spellcasters. This leans them more towards being a sportcaster.
Something like the Circle of Shepherd Druid gets bonuses to their conjuration spells. This leans them much more towards a support caster.
Right, and so on for each Druid subclass. Now, if you aren't sure what your specific Druid subclass is, go by this general rule. If your Druid subclass doesn't give any bonuses to your wild shape, then assume that you're meant to be a support caster most of the time and not use your wild shape in combat. Now, Druids are super interesting, and much like a lot of Matt Mercer's stuff, it has a very macabre feel to it.
It's a fresh take on the usually life-giving, happy-natured Druids.
Let's see what the Circle of the Blighted specifically has to offer as a subclass. Now, the Circle of the Blighted. Those who channel the magic of life and nature often find themselves drawn to a particular shrine or natural site, like crossroads, ley lines, fey crossings, that kind of stuff, binding their body and spirits to those places of power. Such Druids draw vitality from their chosen location, protecting it with their very lives, but not all succeed in defending their sacred realms. Whether through the subtle corruption of vile magics, the tainted presence of an ancient terror like a black dragon or a really high-level undead creature, or some terrible mistake unleashed by the Druids themselves, the land can become cursed with magic that warps any Druid bound to that land. Twisted by their connection to an unhallowed territory, these guardians can come to embody the defiled nature they serve, exalting the natural processes of decay and using it to further their goals, or sometimes to seek out a means to end the curse that plagues them.
Well, there's a backstory.
Now, at second level, these Druids get the Defiled Ground feature. When you choose this circle, you can use a bonus action to corrupt a patch of land or area of water in a 10-foot radius centered on a point within 60 feet of you. This corruption lasts for 1 minute. The corrupted area is difficult terrain for creatures that are hostile towards you.
So your allies are safe.
Additionally, when a creature in the area takes damage from an attack or a spell for the first time on a turn, it takes an extra 1d4 necrotic damage.
Now for this, your allies are not safe.
Right. There's friendly fire here, so watch out. Now you can move this patch of corruption up to 30 feet as a bonus action. Flying creatures are unaffected by this corruption. Starting at 10th level, the area of your defiled ground increases to 20 feet in radius. Additionally, the extra damage dealt by your defiled ground increases to 1d6 when you reach 10th level, and again to 1d8 when you reach 14th level. And once you use this feature, you can't use it again until you finish a short or a long rest.
Now there's something you should note here.
Right. This isn't a spell, so you can still cast your defiled ground even in your wild-shaped form.
The difficult terrain it creates is great because it means that opposing creatures will have a hard time escaping your tank.
Right, but there is a little bit of friendly fire that can happen here, so watch out.
But wait, there's more.
Also at second level, you get Blighted Shape. Your physical form begins to show effects of the corruption you wield, tracing blackened veins across your skin, and producing gnarled, bony protrusions, or other some kind of eerie phenomena. You gain proficiency with the Intimidation skill. Additionally, while you're transformed by your Wild Shape feature, you gain a +2 bonus to your armor class as gnarled spines protrude from your body. Your beast form also gains dark vision with a radius of 60 feet, or an additional 60 feet of dark vision if that form already has it.
So this is a straight buff to your Wild Shape form.
Right, this means that you're going to fight similar to a Moon Druid, where you're going to use your Wild Shape to get into combat and act like a tank or a damage dealer more often than you would, say, stand back and be a spellcaster. This +2 to armor class will help you stay in combat just a little bit longer because your Wild Shape forms are going to be just a little bit harder to hit.
10% harder.
Call of the Shadow Seeds. Now at 6th level, your Druid learns to summon the feral children of the forest from the life force of your enemies. When a creature who is not undead or a construct takes damage in the area of your Defiled Ground feature, you can use your reaction to summon a blighted sapling in an unoccupied space within 5 feet of that creature.
These remind me of twig blights from a Gilpheus tree.
Now you can direct the sapling to make an attack against an enemy creature within 5 feet of it as part of that reaction. The sapling then acts on your initiative, obeying your verbal commands. Now the blighted sapling remains in your service until it is reduced to 0 hit points till the end of your next long rest, or until you summon another sapling. At that point, it crumbles into a foul-smelling mulch. You can use this feature a number of times equal to your proficiency bonus, gaining all expended uses when you finish a long rest. The sapling uses these statistics, and its features scale based on your level and proficiency bonus. Now, we've seen a lot more of this showing up. Now, this is very similar to the abilities you saw come out of Tasha's Cauldron, with the Beast Companion for the Beastmaster Ranger, or the Wildfire Spirit for the Wildfire Druid. But this one's actually a little bit more powerful, because you don't need a bonus action on your turn to be able to command it to do something. You basically just command it on your initiative, and as long as it can hear you, it'll take the necessary actions on its own turn to do whatever you wanted it to do. Now, the sapling isn't as tough as the other companions, and it might be a moot point anyway, because you're going to get an ability later on where you just blow these things up in combat.
Groovy.
Now, for the Blighted Sapling, it's got 10 plus your proficiency bonus armor class. Its stats are fairly weak, and it's vulnerable to fire damage. It has resistance to necrotic and poison. Now, this means that these saplings can stand in the area of your Defiled Ground, and they're not going to be too worried about taking that extra necrotic damage if they take a hit on their turn. For senses, they have blind sight out to 60 feet, and they understand whatever language you can speak.
After 14th level, they even get a multi-attack where they can attack with their claws twice. Now, you can use these saplings to physically block the movement of opponents, or to provide cover, or to provide a flanking bonus if you use that optional rule.
Foul Conjuration. At 10th level, the creatures you conjure are malformed and bloated with toxins. Any beast, fey, or plant, including your blighted sapling, summoned or created by your spells or class features, gains the following traits. Blighted Resilience. The creature has immunity to necrotic and poison damage and to the poison condition. Now, this means that any of your summons can stand in the area of effect of your Defiled Ground and not worry about any of the extra necrotic damage whatsoever.
So that's where you should keep them, in the Defiled Ground, engaged with your opponents.
Toxic Demise. When the creature is reduced to 0 hit points, it explodes in a burst of toxic mulch and fetid viscera. Each creature within 5 feet of the exploding creature must succeed on a Constitution saving throw against your spell save DC, or take necrotic damage based on the creature's challenge rating. And they have a table below for this. Also, as an action, you can just choose to explode one of your creatures,
instantly killing it.
And when you look back at the table, you can see they can do some pretty significant damage. Your Blighted Sapling CR is based on your proficiency bonus, so right here you can see it'll do quite a bit even when you first get this. Now, Incarnation of Corruption. At 14th level, your physical form begins to take on the tainted traits of the land that you are bonded to. Your skin grows ashen, and your eyes darken or turn completely white. Spines and jagged spurs emerge from your body, granting you resistance to necrotic damage and a +2 bonus to your AC. Now, we're pretty sure that this +2 bonus also stacks with the +2 bonus you got from your Blighted Shape when you're in Wild Shape, which would grant them a total of a +4 bonus to their armor class while they're in their Wild Shape form. Additionally, whenever you start your turn within the radius of the corruption created by your Defiled Ground feature, you can use a bonus action to gain temporary hit points equal to your proficiency bonus. Now, that amount is kind of small, but you can do it every time you're not using your bonus action for anything else.
So, standing decision. If you're not using your bonus action for anything else, and you have this feature, then use it.
Now, this is a very cool subclass, if a little dark. There's a very clear progression of power with one feature building on the previous feature.
It provides lots of improvements to your wild shape form, which leans this subclass into being much more of a melee damage dealer, similar to a moon druid.
Now, this class does have a very macabre feel to it, which a lot of Matt Mercer's stuff does in his Exandria.
although we don't know if he actually designed this subclass.
But if anybody knows, let us know in the comments. Now, all very interesting, very cool, but let's put this all together. How do these druids behave in combat?
Now, when they're not wild-shaped, these druids function as support casters.
Support casters are mid-ranged spell or melee damage dealers who protect themselves by absorbing damage with things like high hit points and armor class. And they don't move around very much.
Now, they are spell casters that have a high enough constitution to wade into melee combat, to provide healing, and to cast short-ranged, concentration-required spells to buff their allies or weaken their enemies. Basically, it's an in-and-out style of combat.
Now, if they're going to be casting these healing or buff-debuff spells into combat, that means the druid won't be attacking. This means that they should stay behind the front line of combat, not on it.
That's very important.
They should stay behind the front line of combat about half of their movement speed away, so that on their turn, the first thing they can do is use their movement to get up to the front line of combat and administer any of those short-range buff-debuff spells that they want. After that's done, they can retreat back behind the line the remaining half of their movement.
Now, if you're going to be making a ranged attack, then your druid won't need to move. Just stay at range behind cover like a caster DPS until you need to move up into melee combat.
Now, if you want us to go over what spells you should pick, that could honestly take all day, because druids have tons of them. They are a full caster. They go all the way to 9th level.
But there are some spells that are pretty classic and always a good choice.
So for cantrips, Thorn Whip is a great choice. You're going to be making a defiled ground, and you can use Thorn Whip to pull the creatures into it. It also kind of has a very thematic feel with like a rotted vine or something.
For first level, Absorb Elements, Entangle, Fairy Fire, Healing Word, and Good Berry are all fantastic choices.
Right, and at second level, Bark Skin, Heat Metal, and Flaming Sphere are all great choices along with Pass Without Trace and Spike Growth. Now, it's important to remember that while you're in Wild Shape, you can't cast spells. But going into Wild Shape doesn't break your concentration. So you can cast any of these spells that require concentration and then Wild Shape and you won't lose it.
So spells like Heat, Metal, and Flaming Sphere are great to keep up.
Right, as well as Wall Effects, Crowd Control, all great options.
At third level, Plant Growth and Sleet Storm are pretty thematic.
Right, but you also start to get Conjuration spells. You get Conjure Animals at third level. Now really, any spell that lets you summon a creature is great for this druid, because eventually they get the Toxic Demise feature that lets them turn any of their summons into basically walking bombs. Once you have this, basically anytime you summon a creature, just send it into the bulk of melee combat, have it wail on things until it dies and explode.
Just watch out for friendly fire.
Now at 4th level they get some pretty interesting spells. Conjure Woodland Beings and Minor Elemental and Giant Insect for summons, as well as getting Polymorph, Stone Skin, and Wall of Fire.
Now, once you get Wall of Fire, consider using the ring version of it to keep creatures trapped within the area of effect of your Defiled Ground feature.
Now, that's certainly not all the spells we could cover, and you get to make your own choices about which spells you want to use, but these are some great options.
And any necrotic spell is probably very thematic.
Right, so just pick what you want, have fun with it. Druids have lots of options for spells. Now, that's when they're out of Wild Shape, but once a druid gets into Wild Shape, their role in combat changes.
While Wild Shape, a druid will function much more like a melee tank.
Now, Wild Shape is like a rage mechanic. You activate it and you gain a bunch of temporary hit points, and you get new modes of attacking in melee. Now, Wild Shape only lasts for a certain amount of time, but while it's up, you can basically become a tank for your party.
Once you run out of Wild Shape for the day, you can still function quite well as a support caster.
So if you're playing this druid, you get to make a choice about when you're going to enter Wild Shape. Does your party need a support caster more, or do they need a tank more?
It's nice to be needed.
Now the forms you choose to enter into are really important for your Wild Shape.
These druids don't get access to the beefed up creatures that moon druids do.
Luckily, your Blighted Shape feature gave you a bonus to armor class and gave all of your forms dark vision so that you can still be effective in combat.
And the 14th level incarnation of Corruption gives you the additional +2 to your AC and resistance to necrotic damage.
Now that resistance is good because that means you can enter your own corrupted area of effect, and if you get attacked, that extra necrotic damage isn't going to bother you that much.
As a note, when you're designing your Circle of the Blighted Druid, maybe pick a species that's already resistant to necrotic damage.
Later on, you're going to get that resistance anyway, but it might be good to have it at earlier levels.
After 14th level, standing in your area of corruption will let you gain temporary hit points with a bonus action.
Right, so what animal you choose is still important. But what do you choose? There's actually a really big list of beasts you can turn into, but here are some standouts to get you started. Below 4th level, you can only have a 1/4 CR creature, and it can't fly or swim. So the giant badger, wolf, panther, and boar are all fine choices. The giant badger has a multi-attack. The boar, panther, and wolf can all give advantage somehow. And the giant wolf spider gets spider climb and can do poison damage. These are all great picks. Now, from levels 4 to 7, you can only have a 1/2 CR creature.
And it can't fly.
So some standout options to pick would be the wolf and giant wolf spider, still going strong. But now, choosing a warhorse is actually a good option because they're really tough and they're fantastic for espionage.
Nobody suspects the horse.
And oddly enough, the ape is a great pick because they get a multi-attack and a ranged attack, which is really odd for a beast.
For swimming, choose a poisonous snake, reef shark, or a giant crab, which has grapple.
Now, once you get to 8th level and beyond, you can choose a 1 CR creature that can fly and swim.
Just like moon druids did 6 levels ago.
For this, some standouts would be the brown bear, giant vulture, giant octopus, giant owl, giant spider, or direwolf.
What? They didn't want to say giant wolf?
No, there would have been dire consequences if they had said giant wolf. Now, of course, there are a ton of animal options, and there's a lot of good picks to use outside of combat for things like espionage, for stealth, for infiltration. So go through the animal list and just pick your favorites.
Honestly, any of the options we listed you can't go wrong with.
Now, a melee tank's primary offensive ability is going to be their strength, which most beasts have in abundance. And their primary defensive ability is going to be their constitution.
Since you assumed that constitution, remember that if you have to make constitution checks.
Now, tanks in combat are close-range weapon damage dealers. They protect themselves by absorbing damage, usually with high hit points or heavy armor class.
Or shields.
And they don't move around that much. Now, the main job of a tank is to attract the enemy's attention by charging them and engaging them in melee combat.
Constitution is very important to them because they need the extra hit points to soak up damage that would simply kill most other classes.
Now, the combat tactics for a tank aren't really all that complicated. They engage with the bulk of the melee combatants, they stay there and hit things, and they don't move around very much.
In combat, tanks need to do enough meaningful damage to keep the opponent's attention on the tank and attacking them rather than their allies.
Right, a tank can't just run into melee combat and do nothing.
And they have to keep opponents from fleeing.
Now, luckily enough, the Circle of the Blighted Druid has the Defiled Ground feature. So, your first round of combat is generally going to look the same.
Any of your summons or buff spells should be up before you enter combat.
Right, because you can maintain concentration on them if you enter your wild shape form. Honestly, if you can get into wild shape before combat, that'd be great too, but we're going to assume that you weren't able to do that. So on your first round of combat, the Druid is going to use its bonus action to put up its Defiled Ground feature. Now you want to put this on top of as many hostile creatures as you can, while trying to avoid your allies.
This is because the area acts as difficult terrain for hostile creatures, making it difficult for them to flee. And when they take a hit in combat while in the Defiled Ground, they take extra necrotic damage.
Now, any of your summons, they'll take this damage too, but it doesn't matter. Just send them into combat anyway.
Later on, they'll blow up if you do this. Then, the Druid is going to use their action to wild shape into their animal form.
And whatever animal form you pick will largely depend upon your level and what you're fighting. Once changed into their wild shape form, the Druid will then charge into melee combat, engaging the bulk of the melee opponents, or the big bad evil guy, or the boss, or the leader of that group. Now, on its second turn in combat, the Druid is going to stay put, engaged with the bulk of the melee opponents, and attack them.
Pretty much rinse and repeat this.
Right, that's basically their job. Stay put, in melee, attack things, and make them attack you.
And it's pretty much rinse and repeat. Staying put and making the enemies focus their attacks on the druid is your whole job.
And if the druid is ever engaged in melee and they get knocked out of their wild shape form because the form was reduced to 0 hit points, you just use your next action to turn back into a wild shape form again.
You stay in your wild shape form and attack these creatures until you can't do it anymore.
Right, if you run out of wild shapes for the day, then you would just retreat from the front line of combat and start acting like a support caster instead. But while you have wild shapes, stay in melee. Now, on all of the druids' subsequent turns, they should stay in melee and use their positioning and any crowd control mechanics they have to keep all the creatures inside the radius of their defiled ground.
After level 6, whenever a creature takes damage while in the area of this defiled ground feature, the druid can use its reaction to summon a blighted sapling in an unoccupied space within 5 feet of that creature.
Now, for these blighted saplings, they scale with you, but you can only have one out at a time.
But you can have summons out from different spells out with it.
Now, their attacks aren't spectacular, but you're not really going to use them for that. The Blighted Sapling is going to be used to physically block or cover other creatures, and then it's going to be in melee combat, hopefully to die eventually and explode.
When it explodes, watch out for friendly fire, because this can still affect you or your allies.
Right, but fun note, if you have a bunch of summons stacked really close to each other, and one blows up, and it does enough damage to trigger the other one to blow up, you can make a chain reaction all around the battlefield, similar to playing D&D Bomberman.
Groovy.
These saplings can also provide a flanking bonus if you use that optional rule.
And you should.
Now, unlike, say, the Wildfire Druid's Wildfire Spirit, you don't need a bonus action to command these things. They just act on your initiative. You tell them what to do, and they will take the necessary actions and movement to do that to the best of their ability. Keep in mind, though, they're not the brightest of creatures. Now, at level 10, your summons get immunity to necrotic and poison damage and the poison condition. So this means they can stand right in the area of effect of your defiled ground and attack creatures.
They can also grapple creatures to keep them in place.
Right, but a lot of your summons don't have great athletics checks, so use your best judgment. And at 14th level, you should make sure that your druid is almost always standing inside the area of effect of its defiled ground. They gain resistance to necrotic damage, so the extra damage won't make too much of a difference, and the druid can use its bonus action to gain temporary hit points.
So whenever you're not using your bonus action for something, use this feature.
Now, it's not a lot of temporary hit points, but something is better than nothing. And that's it. That's basically all the information you're going to need. This is enough lore and combat tactics to get you started using the Circle of the Blighted Druid inside your D&D campaign.
And hopefully inside any Exandria or Call of the Netherdeep campaign that you may be into.
Right, these look like a lot of fun. I like these druids, they really spark up your imagination. I enjoy the way that the mechanics build off one another and blend into each other.
It feels more cohesive. This may not be as mechanically strong as the Moon Druid, but it's going to be a blast to play.
And with that, hopefully you enjoyed yourself. Thanks for tuning in. We had a great time talking to you. Try to love each other a little bit more, get vaccinated, enjoy playing these druids inside your next campaign, and... Is it time for school yet?
Bye!
Yeah, 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 yeah.